Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the National Institutes of Health for inviting me to give an overview of the funding schemes offered by the European Union. I will open with a quick acknowledgement that some of the slides and statistics you see today come from the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation, the European Research Council, and the Marie Skłodowska Curie Actions, the latter two of which you'll hear a lot about over the next hour, as well as a very fantastic network of national contact points throughout Europe that also provide additional information and support to people like us, but then also directly to the researchers like you and university administrative staff as well. So I'll take a second here to share my screen. So the goal for today's info session will be to lay out the resources that the EU makes available to researchers and then introduce the two popular bottom-up funding schemes that I had mentioned. You'll hear their names many times over the next hour. I won't do a deep dive in any particular program or fellowship or grant within these two schemes, but rather I'll explain the ones that are out there and how you can learn more and get access to a lot of the training and guides and how-tos that are already out there, as well as how you can subscribe to some upcoming ones that we'll be doing. So we have years worth of info sessions archived on our YouTube channel, both pre-COVID, during COVID. We really increased the number of online webinars we gave or online outreach. And those are all available online. And as a reminder, everything we do is free. So any session we give at somewhere like the NIH or a university, we generally record it whenever we can, whether it's in person or not, and try to make it available. So please do check out our YouTube channel. My colleague will share links to all of our social media profiles, as well as our homepage. And from there, you can access everything. And I do want you to feel well equipped to apply or to learn more and to prepare your application, whether it's for this year or next. For these different grants and fellowships. So my hope is to be able to point you in the right direction and be a great source of information both now and moving forward when you have questions and potentially want to email us. So I will be in close touch with my NIH co-hosts about the possibility of a follow-up in the short term. If there's interest, we could consider bringing in successful American grantees or fellows who went to Europe or US host institutes that have received European fellows or European fellows on these schemes, since one of them goes in both directions, both to Europe and then from Europe elsewhere. So I will give this one of these first slides will be sort of the guiding visual for anything and everything European research and innovation. So the European Commission funds R&I on a 7-year basis. And the current framework program is called Horizon Europe. It was launched in 2021 and it runs through 2027. Today's webinar, is the title mentions, is focused on Pillar 1, or excellent science. So in short, this is generally known for supporting individual researcher mobility and bottom-up project proposals, where the applicant, him or herself, is writing what they propose. It's not based on any predefined categories. So I will be talking about these first two schemes that you see here under Pillar 1. And then for a quick financial overview, it's 95.5 billion euro for R&I over all three of these pillars, again, on over the course of 7 years. So for Pillar 1, for these two components we're talking about primarily, the European Research Council, in short, you'll hear a bit more, is frontier research by the best researchers and their teams. This is, over the course of 7 years, 16 billion euro. That's about 17.4 billion US dollars. And then for the Marie Skłodowska Curie Actions, or what we call the MSCA fellowships, these are designed to equip researchers with new knowledge and skills through mobility and training. So in particular, the MSCA, if you want to do an additional postdoc, for example, is really focused on mobility and getting you to Europe, or if you're already there, moving within Europe. But although this webinar is open to the public, a lot of our examples, or sort of the way I chat with you today, will be with our NIH audience. So this is 6.6 billion euro, which translates or converts to about $7.2 billion. I will briefly remark on Pillar 2. This is global challenges in European industrial competitiveness. These are about international research consortia. It's not the focus of today's webinar, but exactly 2 months ago, we did hold an in-depth webinar on Pillar 2. I can send you a link, or my colleague can share it in the chat. I would say this is for PIs from all countries. These are consortia that are top-down as opposed to the Pillar 1 bottom-up. So these are top-down calls that are defined or created by the EU. They're divided into 6 clusters you can see here with those bullet points, and is what's considered a high-income third country. The US is not eligible if a PI is part of a consortium that applies and is granted or wins a call. They're not eligible for funding except in the health cluster. So that's why I'm very happy to talk today to a largely NIH audience, because this is one area where due to bilateral agreements and historical cooperation, the health calls are open to European funding for US-based PIs. And generally, when I'm talking about countries, or I'm using demonyms, I'm not talking about the nationality of the researcher, the individual researcher themselves, but rather the country in which they're based. Just a small clarification. So you may be an international researcher, you may not be American, but if you're based at NIH or you're based at a US institution, in most of the examples, the language we use when we would be referring to you is an American PI in that case. If there are any questions, please feel free to email us afterwards. We'll be sharing our contact info. And I will also share some novelties of Horizon Europe in the most recent program. So there is now something called the option of being an associated partner. This did not exist under the previous 7-year programs. This means that if you're not receiving funding, if you were, for example, to be involved in clusters 2 through 5 of Pillar 2, you would not need to sign the grant agreement. And this would give some additional flexibility. This is a reason that some third countries did not want to participate in the previous framework program, because they still had to sign this agreement and go over a lot of the legal aspects, but they were not receiving the money. So if you were applying outside of health, which I think very few of you even would consider, it's just nice to know that there is that extra flexibility. And this was not in previous framework programs, as I mentioned. So again, we will share this June 22nd webinar on Pillar 2 as well. So I want to briefly speak the policy context of the European Commission before I jump into ERC and MSCA. If you are interested either in Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, I encourage you to read a report or a publication called The Global Approach to Research and Innovation, and this reflects Europe's strategy for R&I. And for me, being based in Washington, D.C. with my colleague, this also just helps me underscore that these EU values align with American values, such as openness in research, international cooperation to confront global challenges. I think these quotes, or what we've taken from the report, sort of speak for themselves. The threads of academic freedom, research ethics, and respect for human rights are really woven throughout this global approach. So I think you can be confident that a career in Europe or a partnership with European institutions will be in line with these mutual values. So I think it's important for the US to know, and US-based researchers to know that really there is extremely close alignment between the two continents. And I leave here some core thoughts from the European Commission directly on these values. And as a reminder, I won't read them word for word, because I will be sharing these slides afterwards. And you will see in the next hour, there are some slides that I will basically skip or just go over very quickly in the interest of time, so I can leave a tiny bit of time for questions as well. So you will have full access to this presentation afterwards. And this is the first example of a slide I will go over quite quickly. So before I talk about ERC and MSCA, I also want to briefly explain who we are as EURAXESS, or as EURAXESS North America. So my name is Jackson Howard. My colleague, Dr. Daria Butner-Karajan, and I are the Washington, D.C.-based hub of EURAXESS worldwide. So within this entire EU project, there is a very large European presence, and then there's the smaller team of us called Worldwide, and we're based on the continents outside of Europe, mainly acting as your source of information, your initial point of contact. We can guide you to official guides, programs, how-tos. In the case of the US and Canada, there are no national contact points in either country. So if you have a question for us and we cannot provide the answer, we will generally get you in touch with a Europe-based NCP, or national contact point. So we would love to be your first point of contact, whether we can answer the question directly or not. Basically, I just want to emphasize that she and I are here for you wherever you are based in the US or Canada. And again, this is going in either direction. If you are US-based and you want to remain, but you want partnerships with Europe, help finding other researchers, institutions, we will do that in either direction. So you can see here the basic overview of who we are and what we do. Our aim and our mandate is to support researcher mobility and career development, and all of this while enhancing scientific collaboration between Europe and the world. All of our services are free, so you can think of us, again, as your information point for all things related to research and Europe. And I also want to quickly go over the main sections of our website. You'll see the link in the chat. We'll send a follow-up link tomorrow as well. When you're navigating the website, there are a lot of bits of information available at first glance that can be a bit overwhelming if you've never used it before. So the bread and butter is the jobs and funding portal. This is where they're basically centrally maintained databases in Europe that are free to use, free to post, human moderated to prevent spam or malicious posts. They basically start at PhD positions and go all the way up. So you can find, if you're a current or recent master's graduate looking for a PhD, this is where you can find that. You can find postdocs, you can find jobs within academia, and then also in the private sector. So there's been a big push in recent years by the European Commission to make sure that the private sector is also aware of this, and then also that it's for all research stages. I think there's a natural tendency to think only STEM, or that STEM has the lion's share of opportunities, when in reality, we are encouraged and work hard to also reach out to the social sciences and humanities to show the number of opportunities there. At any given moment, there can be between 10 and 13,000 open positions all throughout Europe. And I'll also, in a moment, explain that this means a little bit more than the 27 EU member states. So you don't have to worry about only limiting yourself to certain countries. So the next one is the partnering tool and the hosting. This is the same visual layout and same concept as the database, but this is for finding project partners as well as host institutes. So when you're applying to some of these bottom-up schemes that I'll be mentioning shortly, you need to have a host institute in mind. If you find one independently, that's great. However, this is where you can also just browse and find, it's sort of the equivalent of a job posting, but you're the one obviously writing the project proposal. They're just saying what fields they're strong in, and that they hope to have you link up with them so you can express that they will be your host institute. And I will go into more detail. We also support career development, again, at all stages of your career. We have tools and guides, also archived webinars and trainings from past years. So I would encourage you to spend some time looking at that. And then for information and assistance, we provide country-specific support via the EURAXESS national portals. I'll show a quick graphical layout as to what those are. Derry and I are glad to be your first line of contact in the US again, but if you have a specific question, let's say marine sciences in Denmark, I probably can't answer that question for you. However, there are thematic NCPs, national contact points, and regional ones within Europe who can give you a country-specific or region-specific answer. So we will look into that for you. And then finally, it's not just the two of us here at EURAXESS North America. We have 9 hubs total for EURAXESS worldwide, covering these countries and continents and regions that you can see. So if you have colleagues or friends based in these regions and they want support, you can always direct them to us here at North America. However, we have a presence in most of the world outside of Europe. So I mentioned the national portals and country-specific expertise. These are the 43 national portals that currently exist. Tunisia is the most recent addition. So when I say Europe, I'm referring to 27 EU member states, but then also the countries that have bilaterally negotiated with the European Commission to essentially buy into Horizon Europe or opt into the 7-year framework program for research innovation. And then in simple terms, they can be treated like the EU for that. So I'm not only saying that you have to go to a country or have a partner in a country that is based in one of these 27 countries. It is actually 43. However, this has gone up because as of last month, New Zealand joined. And in the previous 7-year periods, there was a requirement that you had to be in the general vicinity or neighborhood of Europe. So countries like Tunisia and Turkey were historically involved in the past programs as well. However, this is the first time where you don't need to be in the immediate area. You can be anywhere in the world. Canada is currently in the process of negotiating its possible association to Horizon Europe. So New Zealand is the first country that has joined, not within the European neighborhood. So we'll see if they get a national portal. There's already EURAXESS Australia and New Zealand hub. But that said, you basically have country level expertise for all the countries that you see here. There are a few sort of asterisks I would like to say. One is that the UK has negotiated partial involvement. It's a bit piecemeal, you could say. So following Brexit, there are certain programs they do and do not participate in. And I would say the EURAXESS United Kingdom team is extremely well positioned to give you timely updates. Switzerland still has a national portal because they were associated to the previous framework programs. They're not associated to the current one, Horizon Europe. However, the EURAXESS Switzerland team does have information on Swiss government funding or additional ways that researchers can go to Switzerland or cooperate with Switzerland, but I just want to clarify that they're not currently an associated country. So when I tell you that you can look at these 43 national portals and get information, these are examples. A lot of them follow this schematic of 18 different topics within 3 overarching categories. They're all a bit different, but for the most part, this is the most common set. So if you are from Sweden, interested in going to Finland, a lot of these can still be useful. You clearly won't have to deal with visa issues, but you will have to follow a different set of rules when it comes to taxation. If you're coming from the US, you'll certainly have to think about many of these. So the idea is you don't have to worry too much about the friction involved in moving from one country to the other, but rather let your EURAXESS team members support you, and you can focus more on your research. So if you opted in to subscribing for what we call our flash notes, our twice monthly emails, you will get our next one later this month. However, if you didn't, you can always just click that big yellow button on our homepage. We try to keep it to about 10 to 15 little tidbits of events like this one, news that's research related, transatlantic research-related news and EU-related developments, as well as specific funding opportunities. Some are general, like letting you know when one of these mobility schemes is opened. Others are highly specific, like a very specific field at a particular university, and opening in for a postdoc in that position. It'll be of interest to a small number of people, but the idea is if you're spending 5 minutes twice a month just skimming these, you may find something that's really interesting to you. So this email address will reach both Daria and me. She and I are the regional coordinators for the North America Hub, again, in the neighborhood, based in Washington, D.C. So we'd love to visit you in person or have a follow-up webinar, however it goes. And we're very active on social media, in addition to constantly posting on the website and sending these twice monthly flash note emails. So you will be able to click all of these icons in the PDF and move on. So I will start with one of the two funding schemes that we mentioned, and that is the purpose of this webinar. These are the European Research Council grants. So a central component of these grants is the desire for risk-taking research that is high risk and high gain in any field of frontier research. So you can see the three overarching domain structures in this graphic, and I'll give a full list in an upcoming slide. Why should you apply for one? One of the most appreciated aspects of ERC grants are their portability, or this is the fact that they follow you as the researcher and they're not tied to the host institute that you select when you're submitting your application. So if you do find that a different host institute is a better fit, maybe because of the geographic location, it's just, or the university that you go to initially is not the best fit, whatever the reason may be, that grant will follow you when you find a new host institute and move. And there's also the opportunity to win additional funding. I'll explain briefly in an upcoming slide how if you're coming from outside of Europe, there are additional funds that you can request. And then also there is a grant theme for previous ERC grantees. So I'll go to this next slide here. If you were to get what you can call the starting grant, and then years down the road, as you continue in your career, you would be able to get some additional grants that are only for previous grantees. So I'll quickly just describe the typical profile of applicants, or what each grant is structured towards. For the starting grant, this would be a talented early career scientist who has already produced excellent supervised work and is ready to work independently and shows the potential to be a research leader. And I'll sort of convert here to US dollars, the equivalent amount for each grant. The consolidator grant is for a scientist who wants to consolidate independence by establishing a research team and continuing to develop a successful career in Europe. So these would be all for you to go from the US or wherever you're based to a country in Europe. For the advanced grant, these are for established leading principal investigators who want long-term funding to pursue a groundbreaking high-risk project. Again, talking about the risk factor and freeing researchers up to be able to take a big chance. For the synergy grant, these are for researchers that want to address a research problem so ambitious that they cannot be dealt with you or your team alone. And these are for PIs to link up. And you can also have, for example, in this case, a US-based PI, with the other 1 to 3 being based in Europe, if I'm doing the math here correctly. It's for 2 to 4 PIs total. 1 can be outside of the 43 countries that I had just mentioned. And then proof of concept, these are for previous ERC grantees and their frontier research project who now want to explore the commercial or societal potential of their work. So a really unique factor of the ERC grants is that excellence is the only evaluation criterion. So these proposals are evaluated by a selected international set of peer reviewers who evaluate on the basis of excellence. The panel members themselves are selected by the ERC Scientific Council on the basis of their scientific reputation. I should also mention starting grants are perhaps the most popular one statistically. These are very competitive. So the success rate for last year's call was approximately 16%. So it's not everyone that applies will get them. But there are many guides out there. You will find previous grantees, if they've chosen to release their name because of GDPR and respect for privacy, the ERC will release only aggregate data on nationality and host country or host institute of grantees. So if someone chooses not to really publicize themselves heavily, you wouldn't necessarily know. But those that do, oftentimes are happy if you reach out to them and contact them for their insights or to learn more about their project. We've held webinars in the past with both former evaluators who give insights into the application process, but then also with past grantees. I think our most recent example was an American grantee that went to Italy and gave an overview of her research, but then also spent half of the presentation explaining her application process and how she rebuilt her application and really made it fit and ultimately was successful. Then the ERC itself has an excellent website that has FAQs. They publish the work programs that have all the legalese and legal aspects of the funding. But then also on YouTube, they have what they call ERC classes. And this is a playlist with grantees, evaluators, and then ERC staff that explain they're basically the tips for how to apply and make the most of the grant if you're successful. So their social media is also very active and helpful. And again, I've been talking about national contact points or NCPs. I think you can utilize all of these resources. I will say that based on the number of years since completion of your PhD is the primary factor for determining which grant you might be eligible for. So the starting grants are for people who are 2 to 7 years post-PhD. Consolidated grant is for 7 to 12 years post-PhD. And again, proof of concept is for just previous ERC grant recipients. There are additional opportunities if none of these fit into your current career stage, or if you're not successful in your application. These can include joining ERC teams. So some of these grants are for ERC teams, and they'll be allowed funding to hire. So you could just join an existing team. There are visiting research fellowships. There's a mentoring initiative at the ERC. And then there's something called international arrangements or implementing arrangement funding that exists bilaterally. So the European Commission negotiates with countries. And in the case of the US, ever since 2012, their counterpart in negotiating this has been the National Science Foundation. So there is the option of NSF funding related to ERC projects. So I mentioned before the 3 overarching panels and then the sub-panels within them. Your application will fall under one of these. So I will leave it here just for a second, and then I think you can study the PDF when I share it afterwards. But basically, they are expert evaluators in each of these panels, and you would need to identify which one is most relevant to your project proposal. There are a few misconceptions. So the budget is distributed among the scientific panels as a function of demands. So you will I think, be best served by digging into the work program, which is released on a 2-year basis. I will just leave here that the host institution is also not an evaluation criterion. So you can't exactly game the system by strategically choosing your host institution. I think the idea here is that you truly choose the best host for you. So go on the EURAXESS portal, look for universities or institutions that have expressed interest in receiving you as an ERC grantee, and then truly just move forward and include a letter of support from the best one for you. And then people from anywhere in the world can apply. I had said earlier, if you are coming from outside of Europe, there's the ability to request additional funding. And you can also keep your affiliation with your home institute outside of Europe as long as you're spending more than 50% of your time within Europe. So if your US-based institution allows that, you may be able to keep your affiliation. And then depending on the scheme, you can keep your team members, you can have some team members outside of Europe as well. And then just with this idea of portability, grantees can move within Europe for the grant. So I'll leave here the call dates, important deadlines to be aware of. I would not make an individual determination on if you can, from scratch, squeeze in everything in 2 months, but you'll see the starting date deadline is in just over 2 months from now. And then they all have different dates. These are both 2023 and 2024 calls. The following year's calls are released well in advance, including with preliminary dates that are indicative, but not necessarily finalized. In my experience, I haven't seen them change. So if you like the idea of an ERC grant, and the current set of calendars doesn't work for you, what you can do is just keep an eye for when the next year's is released, even tentatively, and feel quite confident that those dates will be final and we'll have plenty of time to prepare. I won't spend too much time going over these figures. I just want to leave this here to underscore the prestige of these grants. And again, in the PDF, you can take some more time to look at it. I also mentioned the ERC classes. So this is where you can go on YouTube and find really good videos that are in-depth and organized by the ERC itself. I also hope you feel encouraged being at the NIH or based in the US in general, that the US researchers have a very high success rate, or at least in terms of raw numbers. They are the country outside of the 43 national portals I mentioned, out of the European Union member states and associated countries, the largest sending set of grantees. So 418 out of just over 1,000, we're talking about 40% right there. So they're active on all the social media channels, as are we. So you'll be able to click these when you access the PDF later. I'll now move on to MSCA. And I'm sorry that I can't monitor the chat at the moment. I'll wait until we get to the Q&A session to look at the chat and the Q&A, but my colleagues should be there taking a look at everything in the meantime. So a quick just distinction that you should be following the distinction between organizations as legal entities versus perhaps you as the individual researcher. Again, as a researcher, your nationality does not matter. And I will be talking also that I will be mentioning how these MSCA fellowships go in both directions, to Europe or within Europe, but then also from Europe elsewhere, like to the US. So US-based universities and institutes can host MSCA fellows. This is different from ERC grants, where it's all about going to Europe. So for the key features, these are the total budget over the 7 years for MSCA is about $7.2 billion. And again, there's worldwide geographic coverage. I want to give a quick overview of what the 5 major fellowships are. So there's doctoral networks. This is for research training of doctoral candidates. The most popular are the postdoctoral fellowships, or PF, since most of them have an acronym here. This is for the career development of postdocs. You'll find many applicants are doing a second postdoc when they choose to apply to PF. Staff exchanges, not for the individual researchers themselves, but for staff that work in the field of administration or any office that supports researchers. So this is cooperation by means of staff exchange, and there are some limited opportunities for non-EU member state or associated country staff members also to participate. Then there's co-funding of doctoral and fellowship programs. And then with the time zone difference, a bit difficult for us in the US, but there's a pan-European researchers night to promote research careers. And in recent years, due to the pandemic, these were online. So I think maybe looking at recent years archived versions of the videos could be quite interesting. So I'll leave here the calendar and the budgets. You can see this is for some of the deadlines are coming up quite soon. I would not recommend trying to, from scratch, again, make your application for the September 13th deadline this year. But in this case, perhaps you could take the full year to prepare for next year's postdoctoral fellowship. And then if you're interested in any of the others, you will have a little more time and we can work with you to either point you in the direction of recent webinars on these or let you know when we're having upcoming ones. So I've been mentioning that within the postdoctoral fellowships, there are 2 programs. There are the European postdoctoral fellowships and then the global postdoctoral fellowships. This graphic from our Irish NCP friends spells it out very clearly. The European postdoctoral fellowships are open to researchers moving within Europe or coming to Europe from the US or another part of the world to pursue their research career. These take place in one of the EU member states or Horizon Europe associated countries, and they can last between 1 to 2 years. Researchers of any nationality can apply. And then for the global postdoctoral fellowships, these are for funding the mobility of researchers outside of Europe. It can be between 2 and 3 years, the first 1 or 2 of which will be in a non-associated third country, so the US in this example, followed by a mandatory return phase of 1 year to an organization based in one of those 43 countries. So only nationals or long-term residents of the EU member states or associated countries can apply. So there are residency requirements. You have to be, again, a long-term resident if you're not a national of one of those 43 countries. And then keep in mind, there are mobility rules. So as an applicant, you may not have resided or carried out your main activity, whether it's work or studies, in the country of the beneficiary for the European fellowships or the host organization for the outgoing phase. That's the global fellowships for more than 12 months in the last 36 months immediately before the call deadline. So basically, if you are a researcher of any nationality currently at NIH, but you want to go to France for a European postdoctoral fellowship, but in the last 3 years, starting a month from now with that deadline, if in the last 3 years you spent more than 12 months in France, you would not be eligible. However, I think a lot of most people in the audience from the NIH right now would have been there for several years without being temporarily based outside of the US. So I presume you'd be eligible. I'm happy to take specific questions. In many cases, what my colleague and I will do is also field these with European-based national contact points who are extremely well-versed and can provide you an authoritative answer. So the application process involves developing an application jointly with your chosen host organization, and then submitting this application to the open funding call published on what is called the European Union's Funding and Tender Opportunities Portal. In short, we call it the Funding and Tenders Portal. So to find a host organization, your existing network of peers and colleagues will be a very important source. And then you can also check the list of hosting offers. They're called expressions of interest, published on EURAXESS and other job portals. So I mentioned before, our bread and butter is the job and funding portal. And then right next to that is the partnership and hosting search portal. This is where you can find, just like with the ERC, universities and institutes that have said they want to receive you as an ERC or MSCA funded grantee or fellow. So in this case, you are considered third country individuals. This is just a little table that explains in the different rows, you have the different actions, and then what are you eligible to do and where can you find these vacancies. So you'll see that the EURAXESS portal is extremely important and basically your first source for finding these. And then where you end up applying will vary, but in the case of the postdoctoral fellowships, it will be the funding and tenders opportunities portal. And then from the third country organizations, if HIs or host institutes, this is where they are able and not able to participate. Again, I'm leaving this in the interest of allowing you more time to look at it when you access it on the website starting tomorrow. So something new under Horizon Europe that I had mentioned previously is that there's this associated partner status where if you are not receiving funds from the EU, you do not have to sign the grant agreement. So this is more for those representing institutions that would like to receive paid fellows. So this option exists for you. Please contact us if you have questions. If you are signing the grant agreement with the EU, you are considered the beneficiary and you do receive the money directly. When it comes to looking for the host organization, again, we're just underscoring the fact that you should be looking on the EURAXESS portal. There's also something called MSCA-net. I'll get to that in the slides coming soon, but there's a matchmaking platform that they've put out there where you can essentially network, and it's a slightly interactive profile-based version of the EURAXESS partner and hosting search portal. And then there's also something called Enterprise Europe Networks. These are for non-academic partners, but if you click the link in the PDF, you'll be able to read in more detail. So there are some new novelties. I mentioned that the EU funds research and innovation on a 7-year basis, and the work programs within that are published on 2-year bases. So these and the current 2-year work program, these are the new changes. Again, associated partners are new compared to previous programs, so the administrative burden has been reduced. I will just leave this here. This is where a lot of people are interested in what your actual salary would be. So basically, with the EU being headquartered in Belgium, they use Belgium is basically the 100% of what they call the country correction coefficient. The US is at 102.3%. So just to give the example of if you were based in Europe, you wanted to come to the US on the global fellowship version of the postdoctoral fellowships, you would take all of the money listed in this table, multiply it by 102.3%, so slightly more, and then convert those euros to dollars, and you would have an idea on the amount of funding that you would be receiving. And again, keep in mind that in certain cases, there is the ability to request additional funds. However, come to me with your specific queries. That's more applicable to ERC. So for some statistics for the most recently available call at close would be the 2021 call. There were 156 funded projects within American and Canadian organizations, and then 90 global fellowships. This involved the participation of 225 North American organizations. And a lot of this information will be available on something called Cordis. It's a website I'll explain in a tiny bit more detail in an upcoming slide. So I had mentioned MSCA-net. Here's some sort of screenshots all thrown together on the information they release. The guides they provide are extremely useful in applying. Every grantee or fellow that's spoken to us says they've used these guides. They're generally released shortly after the call opens. However, they're considered unofficial sources. So they receive EU funding. They are aimed to support applicants and fellows. However, it's not an official European Commission publication, so therefore we say use it as an unofficial guide to enhance your application. And part of this, as you can see in that bottom center, is the matchmaking platform. So I'll give a quick screenshot here of just how they released the current call for the postdoctoral fellowship, the 2023 call. The guidebook is an extremely handy PDF. We'll share the link via the web post where you signed up for this webinar, and you're able to take a look at that. And then there's the matchmaking platform. This was originally launched last year. It was supposed to expire in May of this year, and it was so successful, they extended it until May of next year. So I would encourage you to make a profile. It's on a platform called B2Match. And basically you can make a free profile, list your name and affiliation, and then using the different filters, toggle on your interest and hopefully match with people or with institutions and move forward with an application. So there's a wealth of resources here. I'll leave this in so that all of these links will be clickable when you access the information tomorrow. And then a bit more informally, I'd like to share some additional resources that might be useful. One are the fact that there are many European scientific diaspora networks in the US. We call them scientific diaspora networks, depending on your field. There are also outside of the sciences, but we call them that because historically that's been the term that's been used. So these are researcher networks from different European countries that just have a presence in the US, whether they're all concentrated in the same city, whether they're geographically spread out. Some of them are field specific, others are broad, and it's a small network for the entire group of those diaspora members.
They're extremely valuable because they're plugged into those countries. So if you were interested in Sweden, as an example, you could connect with the STARS network and ask them whatever your questions may be, whether it's top universities to be in touch with. You would supplement your outreach to EURAXESS Sweden with this, but in this case, you'd be talking to Swedes or Americans or other nationalities with an interest in Sweden, who sort of meet on a regular basis to discuss the research landscape in Sweden, and they would help you sort of grow your toolbox, so to say. There's also Europe-based NCPs for the ERC and MSCA. So if you have a question on Horizon Europe in general, or the specific grants and fellowships, there are people within each country that are assigned to answer these questions. In a lot of the third countries, there are NCPs as well. However, in the case of the US and Canada, there are not. There is one partial exception. You can see the last slide here is something called the National Council of University Research Administrators. They historically have been considered the pilot NCP for financial and legal matters. So certain questions can be directed when it comes to legal interpretation or funding related questions. You can ask NCURA in Washington, D.C., and they, on a case-by-case basis, will be able to help you because under Horizon Europe, they're not considered an NCP, but historically they were the pilot NCP, and they're an extremely valuable resource. And then you have over 600 EURAXESS service centers within Europe that are based, again, with regional expertise in all the those different 43 countries. But we can be your first source as EURAXESS North America to all of these. So please feel free to use our website to find them or to reach out if you can. And to continue this list, there is the funding and tenders portal that I mentioned. There's also something called Cordis. This is for historical project data. So you can find past funded programs, statistics. You can search the map. So you could zoom in on Washington, D.C. as an example and find all DC-based organizations that have benefited. And for the funding and tenders portal, you can find the current beneficiaries. And then in the EURAXESS portal, just as a reminder, you have all of those different databases, jobs, funding, and then hosting and partners. So as some examples you can look into, Cordis, for example, has publications, funding information on recently concluded and ongoing MSCA projects. So these are the names and numbers. You'll be able to click these links when you access the presentation tomorrow and find out more about them and their ongoing reporting. As I mentioned earlier, we host lots of webinars and in-person info sessions, and these are really valuable resources. I've just put together here 4 screenshots where we've had these European-based NCPs give talks on ERC and MSCA. So the top 2 were from a recent webinar in the second quarter of this year from our Irish friends, the Irish NCPs, who both pitch Ireland as a research destination. So you can always ask them, you can always ask country-specific NCPs, how their country might be a good fit for you, and then really deep knowledge. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in the postdoctoral fellowships, you can actually check out their June webinar where they explain a lot in detail, and I can share a link in the chat once I've taken a look at the Q&A. Common mistakes, the bottom left, this was an example from another Europe-based NCP, and then in the bottom right, for example, this was an ERC grantee who was explaining his process with the application and why proposals failed. But these are just snippets of these different hour to hour and a half long webinars. All these are archived on our YouTube page, and you can access them all on the EURAXESS North America website as well.